Joining us now is Robert Silverman. He is a freelance reporter and also a contributor to the Daily Beast. He recently published an article titled "How Coward and Phony Tim Pool Became One of the Biggest Political YouTubers on the Planet." Make sure you check out the piece. And Robert, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. I think that this is an important story, not only to understand the rise of Tim Pool, but how certain people are really elevated on various platforms, including YouTube.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I agree. Look, Tim Pool has made a very good living being a political pundit on YouTube, and he has built, this little mini fiefdom of his. But the story isn't, I think, really entirely just about how Tim managed to flunk out of digital media and rise to this level of success. It's about how YouTube as a platform necessarily enables Tim Pool's kind of commentary. And by that, I mean commentary that is sensationalist, that is cranked out quickly, that doesn't necessarily have to be backed up by solid research or insight. And almost as a matter of logistics and as a matter of the function of how YouTube works, it necessarily thrives on conspiracy and ill-advised speculation. And that's the arena that Tim has managed to flourish in, as I said, after trying to make it in digital media and not succeeding, and certainly not to the level he has on YouTube.
Yeah, I want to jump in there. So Robert, I want to ask you about the long con. This reminds me a lot of Trump, but as a prelude to that question, I want to say, look, I gonna vary with you on the structure of YouTube a little bit, right? So it rewards things that certain communities like, right? And then it builds an algorithm loop to reinforce what that community likes. The problem is, I don't think not necessarily in the conspiracies, et cetera, as much as, and that's a big problem, and it's related to this. But I think the number one issue is it rewards passion and emotion, but doesn't necessarily reward facts. And so when you have a phenomenon like that, now connected to the con game here, eventually con men rise up, like Trump did in the Republican Party, and give people what they want. So Republican voters wanted more unfiltered racism, so Trump gave them unfiltered racism, whether it was against immigrants or other groups. And guys like Tim Pool, what you did in the article, which is really interesting, is track his career, filled with tons of research, and we'll put the link down below so people can check it out for themselves, where he starts out kind of nonpartisan, then pretends to be on the left, and then stops pretending to be on the left, but then as part of a right-wing grift, still pretends to be somewhat on the left, right? But meanwhile, what he's really doing is reacting to his audience. And so when people look for that misogyny and that and anti-Black Lives Matter and all those things, then he gives them what he wants. He gets rich, and it creates a vicious cycle, which is great for him and maybe great for racism and sexism, but terrible for everyone else.
Well, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think one thing that Rebecca Lewis, who is an extremism researcher at Stanford University, told me is that, that there's been a great deal of time and energy, both in reporters and in academicians and educators and analysts, trying to understand the ways that YouTube can radicalize its audience. That the more YouTube they consume, the more it drives them further and further to farther extremist content. But I think what we see with Tim Pool is that the converse is also true, is that YouTube over time radicalizes its creators because they get immediate feedback about what works, and without even whether it's conscious that they're doing it or not, they start to lean towards that direction. They start to respond to what the audience is giving them approval for, not just approval, but fame and popularity and money, and all of these things necessarily radicalize their creators. And when I say radicalize, I want to be clear about one thing. I personally have no idea if Tim Pool believes the things that he says on YouTube, and I honestly think it doesn't really matter that much, because the actual impact of the things he says is far more important. And the degree to which those ideas are spread to, again, an audience that reaches, at his peak, was over 100 million views a month. And so the question of whether Tim has been radicalized is it's not really has this one person gone further to the right, but the content that they produce, that you can track and that you can watch change over time. So this question of whether he likes to call himself a centrist or a disaffected liberal or any of those terms that he likes to use, to me, isn't really interesting or one that could be answered, whether it's by reporters or even, a very well-trained psychiatrist who sat down with Tim Pool for many hours. That's not the point.
Right.
Yeah, sorry, go right ahead.
No, this is such a fascinating component of your reporting, and it's something that you kind of see play out in real time. And what I find fascinating, look, you write, here's an excerpt from your piece. A former digital media journalist who originally built up his name with on-the-ground reporting and live streaming, including stints at Vice and Fusion. Pool now postures as a rational centrist, you write, or disaffected liberal who grew to loathe the excesses of the left. And so when we talk about the grift, right? I mean, it's really repurposing a strategy that we've seen on Fox News, where they'll seek out a black person who'll come on the show and say awful things about the black community. And in order for this strategy to work, you would need someone like Tim Pool, someone like Jimmy Dore, someone who pretends to be on the left or pretends to be a Democrat, who's just viciously, constantly attacking the left or Democrats. Once it's abundantly clear that these are just people on the right and they're just spouting the same right-wing propaganda, that's when it's a little less interesting.
Oh, absolutely. I think, look, there was a message that one of Tim's Twitter followers forwarded to me very generously of this one person, in which Tim said, outright, his audience, he considers his audience to be somewhat right wing. And his audience, the way he described it, and this was probably around December 2020, was libertarians, Trump voters, and intellectual dark web type liberals, which to me is just right-wingers.
Right.
But it's the kind of right-winger who likes to say to themselves, well, I'm not a partisan. I consider all sides of the possible when I'm looking at the news. And so what I do is I watch Tucker Carlson. I maybe click on a Breitbart link or two. I will, if I'm feeling risque, I will troll, I'll check out what they're saying on Paul on 4chan. But I also consider what the left has to say because I listen to Tim Pool. I think that's the kind of person who he's appealing to.
It's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, look, we've seen this scam now countless times. Dave Rubin did originally.
Dave Rubin starter kit, really. I mean, look, you could say it goes back to David Horowitz too, if you want to really.
That's right.
Delve into history, yeah.
That's right.
I mean,
you guys look up David Horowitz. He ran that scam decades ago, but he didn't have the power of the algorithms behind him to make it more credible and et cetera. And again, guys, algorithms can be good or bad. It could set up wonderful communities and it could set up communities like this. But one of the things you should know is what's real and what's not real, right? So then, Robert, that leads me to that question. I mean, you talked a lot about it and gave a lot of examples in your article, but it doesn't look like Tim's telling the truth on many things. So when you look into his past and his career, not just about his ideology, but where did he work and what jobs did he have? Is this guy telling the truth about any of this stuff?
I spent a lot of time looking into the claims that Tim has made, and a lot of them ended up just not being factually accurate. Let's put it that way. Tim says, and he says this often, and I think actually it was one of the reasons I first started looking at Tim, because I used to write grants for a nonprofit organization. And Tim said he was the fundraising director of a nonprofit. He doesn't name the nonprofit, mind you. He just says he held that job. Sometimes he's the managing director of many nonprofits or a director at many nonprofits. And he said this, and I immediately thought that sounds strange because I didn't know that he had dropped out of high school. And I thought fundraising director of a nonprofit is not a kind of job that most high school kids get, let alone someone who's in their early 20s, period. So I just, I watched a great deal of his content and I came upon a bunch of places where he did name them. And I called them and I asked. And what Tim was doing is he was street canvassing. He was one of those kids you see on the street asking for signatures and donations, and he refers to it as being a fundraising director or having fundraised for nonprofits. And that would just, you can almost excuse that as just resume pumping or a white lie or something like that. But when Tim talks about nonprofits being all corrupt or they're scams or they're designed to separate people from their money and they don't really believe what they say, which I think is a very telling way for Tim to put it, he does so as if he is privy to the inner workings of these organizations. And that's why I felt that particular non-truth was important to include. I mean, he also doesn't really seem to tell his audience all the things that, his truest beliefs either. There are 3 occasions in the story that I've reported where, Tim is famous. It's almost a meme at this point. That whereas if there's any little blip in the culture war, Tim will make a video saying a civil war is imminent now. I know this to be true. The one example which I use in the story, which really cracks me up, is that I don't know if you recall this, it was a local news story, but a lightning bolt hit a George Floyd mural. And a bunch of, some of your TCOT and MAGA types on Twitter were saying, look, this is a sign of God's will saying Black Lives Matter is bad. Okay, it was dumb culture war fodder. It was something that happened online for a minute. Tim decided to make a video about it. I don't know what you could say about this except to cite the Twitter beeves, but by the end of the video, Tim is actually telling his audience that the left, this amorphous, multi-pronged monster that is out to destroy us all, is actually, by definition, in opposition to, and he used this phrase, the natural order of things. And this was all in a 20-minute video about a lightning bolt hitting a mural. So everything Tim says is suddenly like civil war is going to come any minute now, the states will break up, the end is nigh. But in private, Tim uses a slightly more pointed phrase, and that phrase is race war. He said it in 2019, according to a Black employee who was working for his media company that has since gone defunct and amidst allegations of a cat kidnapping. But Tim said to this employee, the only Black person in his employ, that a race war is coming and that Tim couldn't tell which side he's going to be on. So you should probably choose one. And 2 other people who are familiar with that conversation backed it up. He said it again in 2017 during Free Speech Week. It was actually your old buddy Carl Sargon of Akkad Benjamin who was screaming that the media is purposely reporting on race issues in order, because the media wants a race war to happen, as which common knowledge, yes, we all do. But he was saying that the media is trying to divide the country and it's going to lead to this race war. And Tim, was agreeing with him frequently throughout this. This was, he was talking to Daniel Ambroso, the director of White Noise. He said it a 3rd time to someone at Fusion when he was covering early Trump rallies when he was still working for Fusion. I mean, there's not a lot of people I know who say that a race war is coming as sort of a casual conversation point. And that to me is a very pointed way of looking at the world. And the fact that he doesn't say race war on air, but instead talks about civil war, I guess is one way you could think of selling a more acceptable entry point to his commentary to an audience that might not consider itself hardcore MAGA or hardcore conservative.
Yeah, and I mean, when you consider some of the violence that's broken out, of course, the most prominent example is January 6th. These Trump supporters thinking that they're gonna storm the Capitol and overturn the results of the election, topple the government. I mean, it gives you a sense of how destructive these types of narratives can really be. But what I find so fascinating about your angle in this reporting is that unlike the Dave Rubins, who were certainly backed by corporate money, who were backed by people like the Koch brothers, right? They were receiving, grants or donations, whatever you want to call them, in order to put this garbage content out. It's actually the opposite with Tim Pool, where he's not being radicalized because he's being funded by corporate donors or anything like that. He's literally being radicalized by the rewards he receives through this sensationalized, even violent content that he puts out there, right? So he gets the positive reinforcement and it creates that vicious cycle. Is there any discussion among these platforms that host him about maybe reconsidering the incentives on these platforms? You get what I'm saying? Like, are they aware? Are they even aware of how the algorithm, I think, it's an unexpected or unintended consequence, but are they aware that this is happening? And if they are they planning on doing anything about it?
Well, you're going to have to talk to a better sourced reporter than me. I don't have any information about what the platforms might or might not be considering. I think the only thing I can say is there is nothing that Tim said on YouTube that would have violated any rules. He's brought Alex Jones on a couple of times. By the literal, by the letter of the law of YouTube's rules, he has not broken any rules. He is, in fact, incredibly careful about staying away from strikes. He never curses. When they submit YouTube guidelines for discussing COVID or discussing the election, he posted this on Twitter, in fact, that YouTube had told him you can say that the election was stolen and that there was fraud, and you can say that Donald Trump was the rightful winner, but you can't say them both at the same place at the same time, as if that somehow changes the argument that's being made. So Tim would say that. The way Tim put it in this wonderfully Tim Poolian way is that he felt that Donald Trump had been Ocean 11. He was the victim of an incredibly careful and long, complicated plot that possibly involved Brad Pitt eating snacks and nefarious shadowy forces at all levels of the public and private sector, which ended up in him losing, but the election wasn't stolen, mind you. So that's how Tim Pool avoids these rules breaking. I mean, all I can say is whether they're reconsidering it. I think you can only look to the fact that one, they declined to comment when I asked them. I asked them about a number of statements that Tim Pool had made about having very chummy contact with YouTube, and YouTube didn't even decide to say no, that's not true or nothing. They just decided not to say, and I don't think I think that Tim Pool is telling the truth when he says that YouTube is perfectly happy to have him be an acceptable version of right-wing dialogue on their platform so that they don't get yelled at by conservatives for censoring the right. I think he is absolutely right about that. That in fact, I don't think not only do they not plan to remove him, I think they very much want to keep him around. Now, I have no actual sources or reporting that can back up that complete and utter speculation. I'm just going by the fact that there is no demonstrated by action by YouTube, even a bland press statement, which would suggest otherwise.
Yeah, look, I don't even think that they necessarily should. I think deplatforming is extreme, and I'd be very careful about it, because then you start to weed out opinions that are legitimate but not within the corporate rule and mainstream, et cetera. So, but in this case, what your reporting does is really important, because it lets you know, okay, he might claim this, but let me show you what he actually believes, right? And so I think that the truth is the best disinfectant. It's not nearly perfect, of course, and most people will not see that in their algorithm. They won't see that piece, unfortunately, and so they'll be unaware of it. But I don't know that I'd want YouTube to take action. And by the way, they're not unsophisticated, meaning Tim Pool and the other grifters, in that they understand where the rules are. Now, by the way, you don't curse. Now, we don't curse because we're on other platforms where it's simply not allowed. We're on a dozen platforms, right? But on YouTube, you can curse. But if you do curse, some of your videos will be demonetized.
Right.
And that'll take off a wing of Tim's house, and he doesn't want that, right? and so, okay, that's fine, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? But what he's trying to do is gain fake legitimacy, which allows him to basically go under YouTube's radar. And so, and if he actually was a centrist, well, there'd be nothing wrong with that at all. If he was any of the things that he claims to be, well, you might disagree and we might think it's terrible or abhorrent, but it's perfectly acceptable. The question is it real or is it not real? And what is it driven by? And then, which leads to the last question. Look, when you get to the fake legitimacy, you don't want to say, as we've talked about before, I'm just a right winger, because that's uninteresting. There's a lot of right wingers, right? So that you have to have, if you will, left face, right? So, I'm part of the left. I'm a classical liberal. I'm even further left than the other people on the left, but I like to attack the left nonstop, right? There's all these different versions of left face, right? And then, but hey, look, I'm legitimate. I don't say race war. That would get me in trouble with the platforms. I say civil war, right? So that's why exposing them for what they actually believe through facts that you showed is so important. But anyway, the last question then, Robert, though, is when you realize that phenomenon exists, how easy is it to manipulate? I mean, if outside forces came in, whoever they might be, and they started giving money through Patreon or honestly YouTube Super Chat or any of these things, and they started giving at enough levels for the creators to notice, it would seem that it would be, if the creators are not really strong and principled and haven't been around a long time or whatever, or they could be new and principled, but if they're not really, if they don't have a moral core, it would seem that it would be fairly easy to manipulate them by giving a little bit here and a little bit there, let alone a lot here and a lot there, not at the Coke level money, but man, you see a couple of Super Chats and Patreons go in a certain direction when you say one thing, and then leave you when you say another thing. That might set up an incentive that could work really well in manipulating tons of creators.
Yes, I think you're very much right. I think the areas, the ways, and this is a little bit above my pay grade reporting wise, but I think we have created a system for mass distribution, one that has very little to no regulation. Let alone anything even resembling a gatekeeper. And that can be, look, that can be good and bad in all kinds of different ways. But anytime you create a new means of communication, clever people, moneyed people, and clever people with money are going to figure out a way to use it to their best advantage. And I think, again, I'll be a little cagey here. It's something that I'm absolutely looking into. It is the very beginning of my reporting process, and so good job for you for that's a good guess. But it's not something I can even begin to start talking about. But I'll just be coy and I'll say yes. I think you are right. This is an area that is very much ripe for a great deal more reporting.
And by the way, look. No matter where anybody's ideology is, we're fair. So having read your piece, I would be surprised if that was the case for Tim. I would not be surprised in other instances. But Tim seems to have found like a right-wing misogynistic audience that's relatively real and is just serving them exactly what they want. And part of what they want is someone pretending that they're from the other side and saying, well, I'll tell you, you guys are so right. It largely is black people's fault. And women's fault, oh my God. And Tim literally says that. You have a quote in your piece about how he's not getting dates because it's not him, it's women. If you say so, brother, okay? And a lot of people do say that, and that's why they go, oh yeah, me too. And they support Tim in that way.
Right.
Yeah, well, one last thing I'd just like to say about Tim, and I'm very, I report a lot of things in this piece that in fact are quite critical of him, and I spoke to a lot of my sources who were very critical of him, and the research I did, leads, it very much paints a portrait that is without a doubt critical. I think Tim Pool would not be nearly as appealing as he is if there weren't a kernel of truth embedded in the things he says. Not that he is necessarily painting an accurate picture of the world, but for people who feel like the political parties, be they the Democratic or the Republican Party, aren't really serving their best interests, particularly if you're not a person of means. For people who feel like the mainstream press, a great deal of the time, does not, in fact, accurately reflect the world that they live in. For people who feel like something has gone terribly, horribly wrong with the state of the world in 2021, Tim is pinging those emotional cherries. And I don't think anyone who reacts to the world that way with a sense of deep-seated dismay and suspicion is necessarily in the wrong. I just think that the answers that Tim provides and the things that Tim believes about the way the world works are in fact quite wrong. But the things that he's touching on, I don't think should be devalued at all. And for anyone who feels that way about the world, I'm not here to say you should not think that. You absolutely should think that. I just think that there are better sources of information that might help explain some of those feelings of dismay and questions that a person in the world might have.
I'm so glad you mentioned that. We're out of time, but I'm glad we got that point in. The mainstream media is broken. And politics is broken. It's not just a kernel of truth. There's tons of truth there. That isn't the question. The question is, where do you direct people after that? If you direct them to it's black people's fault, it's George Soros's fault, it's women's fault. Well, you're taking something that's true and then misdirecting them. Or it's progressives' fault, it's the Justice Democrats' fault, or whatever. You pick a category, right? There are real answers like money in politics and corporate rule, etc. But that is not where these, in my opinion, charlatans are going. Thanks for watching The Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.